Hello, my name is Raina Peter, and I am a discussion group coordinator and a member of the Student Advisory Board at the Dole Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program made possible by Newman's Own Foundation. Today's program will be live streamed and available on our YouTube channel afterward. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. For virtual viewers, please send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. Please ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming this semester's Dole Fellow, Bob Blaemire.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Raina. Welcome. I'm happy to be here at the Dole Institute once again. Let me first say that this program wouldn't be possible without generous contributions from the Newman's Own Foundation, and we are also presented in partnership with the Howard H. Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, and the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. Also, as a programming note, our next session was originally scheduled to be next Wednesday, the 30th of March, with Nancy Landing Castlebaum, Kansas's own former senator. And she's had to reschedule, so that is now going to be April 20th, Wednesday, April 20th at 3 p.m. instead of 4 p.m. So hopefully you'll be joining us then. Our next session in this program is 2 weeks from today, when John Shaw from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute will be here as my guest. Again, my name is Bob Blaemire. I'm the fellow this year. I came here in a roundabout ways because I had written a biography of my former boss, the senator I worked for from Indiana, Birch Bayh. And in putting together this program, one of the things that occurred to me was a senator I've been a big fan of for a long time, who actually Senator Bayh described to me as the most decent colleague he ever had in the Senate, was Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And I thought one of the cool things about having Senator Leahy represented is, while we're discussing the differences between the Senate and the era in which I worked and where Birch Bayh was a senator and Bob Dole was a senator, Senator Leahy represents both eras. He's still there. He came in 1974 and is still there now. So let me read you a little bit about Senator Leahy's biography before I introduce our distinguished guest, and then we'll get into it. And I hope that some questions will be generated here from the audience and those of you at home. Patrick Leahy, soon to be 82 years old, is now in his 8th term of office as a senator from Vermont. He was first elected in 1974. He is President pro tem of the Senate and Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. At age 34, he was the youngest U.S. senator in Vermont history and the first non-Republican senator elected from Vermont since 1856. He's the only Democrat ever elected to the Senate from Vermont and one of the only 3 Democrats to represent Vermont in either house of Congress since the end of the Civil War. He's also the only sitting senator to have served during Gerald Ford's presidency and one of 2 who have served in Jimmy Carter's presidency. He's the longest-serving U.S. senator Vermont has ever had. And interestingly enough, in 2001, you may remember the anthrax attacks in the Capitol. He was one of the 2 senators who were targeted by the anthrax attacks that ended up killing 5 people. He was also the presiding officer at Donald Trump's second impeachment trial, therefore becoming the first senator to preside over a former president's impeachment trial. Recently, last November, he announced he would not be running for election this year in 2024 and will be retiring from the Senate. One of the interesting, he's had a lot of elections, obviously. This is his 8th term. One of the interesting ones that I recently read about and wanted to share with you is that in 1998, in the Senate election in Vermont, he ran against a man by the name of Fred Tuttle. And those of you might, I don't expect you to remember that Fred Tuttle was a retired farmer and the lead actor in a mock documentary film called Man with a Plan, shot in Vermont in which a farmer decides to run for Congress. After winning the Republican nomination in a campaign designed both to promote the movie and to mock ostensible the GOP frontrunner, who had only recently moved to Vermont from Massachusetts, Tuttle recommended that voters support Leahy. Leahy was touched by this gesture. He and Tuttle made several joint appearances during the campaign, and Leahy said of Tuttle that he was the distilled essence of Vermonthood. Leahy has represented a lot of the somewhat typical issues of being pro-choice, for gun control. He was against the Iraq War, but he was also one of the early people to warn us about some of the overreactions our country had after 9/11 and the rush to patriotism and urging the government to remember to protect our rights, our individual rights, and our privacy. And with us today we have Luke Albee. And Luke has a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Vermont. Luke has served as the chief of staff for two senators. First, he worked for Senator Leahy starting in 1982 and was his chief of staff from 1993 to 2004. Left to join a consulting firm so he could make some money and afford to send his kids to college, but not long afterwards went back and became the first chief of staff for Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. So he was chief of staff for Warner for 6 years and Leahy for, 11, and was described by Politico as the dean of Senate chiefs of staff. So dean...
That means old. That means old.
Well, if they're going to call you old, I don't want to talk about how old I am. So let me introduce Luke Albee.
Thank you.
So Luke, why don't you start off by telling us how you got there?
Well, first I want to say, I'm honored to be here. It was a real thrill to be invited, and I feel like when I heard Senator Kassebaum is next, think of me as like the warm-up band for a real statesperson. When I watched previous videos of previous speakers, there's always a point where Bob and whoever he's talking to kind of try to out-old the other one, like who is there the longest. I just want to say two things. One, Madonna and I share a birthday. And the truth is, she's 1 year older than I am. You know, on the downside...
Which makes you still younger than me, by the way.
On the downside, when I started working for Senator Leahy, and I'm looking at the young people here, when we would do a press release, we would fax it to Montpelier office, the capital of Vermont. They would make 2 copies of it, and they would walk to the bus station and put 1 copy on a bus to Brattleboro and 1 copy on a bus to Bennington. So it's like 1 step up from the Pony Express, but that's how long I've been around.
Well, I often tell people when I'm walking people around the Senate that the 3 buildings that are there were named for senators who were all serving there when I worked there.
Right.
So that's how old I am.
See, I told you it would be a competition. Who's older?
Yeah.
Bob wins.
My career ended before his began in the Senate, so there you go. So tell us about how you got there, because I think it's an interesting story.
There's an interminable story and there's a shorter story, and we'll go with the shorter story. I was, my senior year at the University of Vermont, I basically had every lousy job you could imagine. I grew up on a small farm, a quote-unquote farm. My parents are gentlemen and gentlewomen farmers. But my first job was at McDonald's. I was a dishwasher. I tarred foundations for houses. And I got a good job in college. I was a busboy and a waiter. And one night when I was a senior in college, I was a busboy for Senator Leahy and his entourage. And he had just come out in favor of the SALT II nuclear arms reduction treaty. And it was something I had studied. It's something I thought was in our national interest. I think, for the record, Senator Dole was against it. But I was so honored to have cleared his plate that I went home, got my typewriter out, and applied to a summer internship in his office, and got rejected. And the story goes that at that point, I vowed one day to run his office. I ended up immediately after college going to graduate school, basically because I didn't have any idea what I do, and got a master's degree in international relations. You know, the one most memorable part of my graduate degree was my tutor at the London School of Economics. I handed in my first paper. I was really, really proud of it. And he gave it back to me, and he said, this is a combination of overgeneralization, non sequitur, and sheer idiocy. So that's how my graduate, we became very good friends, and we're still good friends. He was head of the International Relations Department at Cambridge, but he was really one of my mentors, but he was a pretty blunt mentor. Anyway, the bottom line was, I moved to Washington. I got an interview in Senator Leahy's office, not that I was going to be a waiter again, and I went out and I bought a powder blue sport coat, I bought a pair of shoes, I bought a belt, had my interview, and then was called back for a second interview. And I said, do I have to buy another outfit? And I said, no, who would remember this powder blue sport coat? So I went back and ended up getting a job with him. And that was answering multi-issue mail, which meant I would write transition sentences. If someone said, I'm for nuclear arms control and please do something about dirty air, I would write the transition sentence. And from there, my career was launched.
You know, I love your story about how you got there, being a busboy, and I assume that you weren't very good at it, which is why you needed to get out of it. But
I actually was really good at it.
You're really good at it. So we're talking in this series about the differences between the way the Senate was and the way the Senate is. And what I said earlier about Senator Leahy, he represents both eras. Mm-hmm. So how do you think he would characterize the Senate we have now compared to the Senate that he joined in 1975?
I think he would say the Senate today is a pale imitation of what it was for a variety of reasons. And we can talk about this and share ideas. But so many things have happened. So many things have happened since 1975 when he was sworn in. So many things in how folks send their representatives to Washington. I mean, I have to say, one thing that hasn't changed, and probably the Senate is one of the only institutions in America, if you walk into a Senate office today, like you'd walk into a Senate office in 1975, it looks exactly the same. It looks, there are two people sitting there answering phones. There are people, this is in the Hart and Dirksen building, crammed into rooms, which, is, when I started working with Senator Warner, we had hired so many people in our temporary offices that I insisted that they move all the desks out and basically move in what I called junior executive desks, which were like third grader seats that had these hand things. So it looks exactly the same as it did, but everything else has changed. And the biggest thing is there were many, many, many more senators back in those days who actually wanted the institution to work. And Senator Dole was one of them. That doesn't mean that there weren't titanic struggles. As I was looking at the glass, the exhibits, and I would see, Senator Dole led the fight against Bill Clinton, who tried to pump $18 billion in to prop up the economy, and it was wasteful government spending. I'm like, yep, I was in that fight. We lost to Dole then. And how Clinton tried to nationalize healthcare, which actually wasn't true, but it's like, yep, I lost that one too. But the point was, there were so many senators there, and Senator Dole included, who at the end of the day wanted the Senate to function. And part of that is that there are issues that really have nothing to do with what political party you're in. Agriculture is a perfect example of that. Transportation is another example of that, where what matters is your home state. And so Vermont was an agriculture state. It had a bunch of small dairy farms that were struggling to keep up with these mega farms. We would always cut deals with Republicans from Mississippi. Senator Leahy's, one of his closest friends was Senator Lugar from Indiana. And we would support their farm interests. They would support our farm interests. And some of the biggest battles we were fighting were Democrats who thought farm programs were wasteful. Mm-hmm. When it comes time to with transportation, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. If you're from Montana, You don't care that much about mass transit. You don't care that much about the Amtrak corridor between Washington and New York and Boston.
Rush hour does not exist.
Yeah, no, right. No, that's true. And so I do have real memories of Senator Dole. And he had, for a lot of you young folks, when you saw Senator Dole at the end of his life, he was in his wheelchair and he was 87 years old. He had such a presence and he exuded such power. And it wasn't just that he looked like a senator, he was so smart and he was so tough. And when he walked into a room, it was time to do business. Jesse Helms, who was one of the last basically segregationists in the Senate from North Carolina, for a long time was chairman of the Ag Committee. He had zero interest in doing farm bills. And what would basically happen was Bob Dole would come in and Dole would do the farm bill. And what I remember, and always cut me off because sometimes I just start talking and don't stop. But one great thing about being a junior staffer who was single and had no life was I hung around the Senate. And I would frequently, for older staffers who had kids at home, I would volunteer to go sit on the floor of the Senate late at night and listen to the debates. And I was in awe and mesmerized. But at a certain point, and Senator Dole so understood the rhythm of the Senate, he would come in, he always had a pen in his bad arm, and he would whack his thigh, and he'd say, okay, send your last press releases out because we're cutting a deal in an hour. And so he would understand there's a political nature to everything. There are these fights. In a way, it was like professional wrestling. It looks like you're really, really fighting, and at some level you are, but at the end of the day, you have to come together. And so in those days, there were many more institutionalists. And there's one more thing, but I'll stop talking for a minute if you want to.
No, one more
thing. The other
thing,
and for you undergraduates who are thinking about, what am I going to do my term paper on, if you still do term papers. The biggest difference in the Senate was its makeup. And that is, there were moderate Republican senators who represented blue states. And I'd never counted Bob Dole as a moderate Republican in those days. I thought of him as a conservative Republican. And so you had Bill Cohen in Maine. You had Bob Stafford in Vermont. You had Charles Mathias in Maryland. You had Packwood's another story, but you had Packwood and Hatfield in Oregon. And a few others who escape me now. And then you had very conservative Democrats from red states. So you had Lloyd Benson from Texas, and you had Bennett Johnston from Louisiana, and you had David Boren from Oklahoma, and you had Howell Heflin from Alabama, and you had Sam Nunn from Georgia. And so the domestic politics of the blue state Republicans and the red state Democrats were to more go toward the center. Whether it's centripetal or centrifugal force, I don't know what that is. But basically, the Republicans couldn't be knee-jerk Reagan supporters, and the Democrats couldn't be knee-jerk Reagan opponents. And so the forces in the Senate brought the body together. And that's now gone. Gone. If you look, I think Susan Collins was the only Republican senator elected in the last cycle where Trump
had
lost in Maine. Every other state, it just matched up. People are just voting. You're voting for the Republicans or you're voting for the Democrats. And an ancillary problem is if you're a Republican today, and my father said, anything worth stating is worth overstating. If you're a Republican today, the political pressure you feel is from the right, not the left. And if you're a Democrat, especially if you're in the House, the political pressure you feel is from the left and not the right. And so as a consequence, you get senators who either are the real kind of right-wing deal, see Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, I think your new senator from Kansas is kind of elbowing his way into that group. Or you get Republican senators who you kind of feel like want the institution to work, but not so much that they would buck their leadership and make that happen.
Yeah, so we're touching on right now the subject which I think is central to this, which is why it's not working so well and what has happened. So there have been various markers throughout our history. When do you think the changes started happening?
Whenever I talk about anything that happened before Beanie Babies were invented, my kids call that the olden days.
When were Beanie Babies invented?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Anyway, I think part of it was televising the Senate. Because in that, all the good government, the good government people and I don't agree on anything. Like, sunshine isn't always good. And once the Senate was televised, it became a much more performative stage. And you're allowed to bring charts down. So it wasn't enough to debate a woman's right to choose. Bob Smith from New Hampshire would have to bring charts down that had pickled fetuses in, and it just became a stage for senators, and it wasn't, there are no innocents here. The Democrats did a lot of the same thing, but you used it as a platform to attack the other side. So that's one. Number two, and just for the record, the Supreme Court is not televised, so I'm not for that. Number two, I think getting rid of earmarks was terrible. Because earmarks, which didn't raise the budget at all, earmarks were something that are carved out of the budget pie and it's directed spending, but it was a way for leadership to exert some power over its members. Because most members, wanted to do right by their state. And so more senior senators had some ability to affect how more junior senators vote. And that went away. They've actually just come back to some degree. But I think a pivotal moment was the Gingrich Revolution. And I think, for the record, Newt called Senator Dole the tax collector for the welfare state, just for the record. But Gingrich came in, he saw his path to power was to burn the House down. And, he attacked and ran against more moderate Republicans for the leadership. And in 1994, there were a bunch of Gingrichites who migrated over to the Senate. And one of the leaders was a guy from Pennsylvania named Rick Santorum, who you might know of from his CNN commentary. And one of the first things that happened was Senator Hatfield, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, very respected moderate Republican from Oregon. There's a big debate over the constitutional amendment to mandate a balanced budget. And there's arguments on both sides. I oppose it. Senator Leahy opposed it.
Birch Bayh opposed it.
Birch Bayh opposed it. But Mark Hatfield opposed it. And he was a deciding vote. And after he did, Santorum, who was a freshman who basically didn't yet know where the bathrooms were, came down and did a press conference and demanded that the Republicans strip Senator Hatfield of his chairmanship. And it was kind of just a little earthquake. Other things, before we get to the bad new days, and we're talking about the good old days, I'll give you one other story about Senator Lugar and Senator Leahy, who were very, very close personally, and we worked together on farm stuff. Senator Lugar ran for president in 1988, I believe.
I think it was 88.
Okay.
And let me just interrupt to say that Senator Lugar was from Indiana, as was my boss. My boss beat him in 1974. He was the mayor of Indianapolis. He then got elected to the Senate 2 years later. they served together as colleagues and became close friends.
He was
Again,
right. He was a
an
Rhodes
illustration
Scholar.
of a different era.
He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was known as Nixon's favorite mayor.
Yes. The last time he saw Nixon, by the way, Nixon leaned over to him and said, "You were my favorite mayor."
And ironically, he was one of then Senator Obama's partners in nuclear nonproliferation. It's the thing that ultimately beat him. He got beat by a Republican guy in his primary. But the story is, Lugar ran for president. And the rules were, when you take public money, you had to get to get public money, you had to get over a threshold like 10% in several states. And Lugar's campaign never really took off, but there was a Vermont primary, and Senator Leahy and I sat down and talked, and we said, we're actually going to go all in and help Senator Lugar get to 10%. So basically, our whole political apparatus, Democrat, liberal Democrat in Vermont, went behind Senator Lugar and helped him in his campaign.
Which is unheard of today.
And at the end of the day, the head of the Farm Bureau, when we were trying to get the Northeast Dairy Compact extended, which is, again, for our small, some would argue inefficient dairy farmers, we brought down the head of the Vermont Farm Bureau, who gave Senator Lugar a scrapbook of his time in Vermont. And ultimately, Senator Lugar helped us get that extended. So those were the good old days.
Well, by contrast, then he mentioned Rick Santorum. I mean, I heard a story at the time. I don't know if it was true or not, but at night when Santorum came to the Senate, Joe Biden greeted him on the floor of the Senate and said, "Nice to meet you, Rick. Congratulations on your election. I look forward to working with you." And Santorum said, "I don't know why. We're not going to get along on anything." So there was a change. The Gingrich Revolution represented a change in civility in both bodies. He counseled his members not to have homes in Washington, to go home on the weekend. A bunch of them started living together in apartments. And the civil relationships that members had started to diminish, both houses. But that was really the time, the big sea change, I think, in terms of the social interactions that took place. It's really hard to call somebody names when you've had dinner with them the night before.
Right. And I also think that we're getting closer to modern times now. The 2010, so many different things were happening, and part of it was how the atomization of how we all get our news. And in a way, it both spread out when we were all younger. I'm not pointing at you guys. 90% of America got the same news every night. It was Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and
Peter Jennings.
Who was before Peter? Huntley Brinkley.
Frank Reynolds.
You had daily newspapers, and you watched the same news every night. And what I saw when I went back with Senator Warner, with Senator Leahy, because the Bush 2 was we'll talk about 9/11 and anthrax, but Karl Rove brought in a different, more coarsening battlefield. And I would always have Fox News on in my office. And whenever I saw, Senator Leahy question John Ashcroft about something, I knew that our phones would light up. So I would walk around to the receptionists and say, brace yourself, it's coming. And invariably it would come, and it would be like a wave, and it would last a half hour, and it would be gone. When I started with Senator Warner, it wasn't just Fox News. It was the internet. And it was, OAN and all the other things where the amount of incoming that could be generated made our offices almost buckle. With Obamacare, which incidentally, it's the 12th anniversary of Obamacare
today,
which is founded, basically, they won't say it out here in the hallway, but it's kind of based on a Heritage Foundation, Dole, Chafee outline. It's helped 30 million people get health care. We probably had over 1 million Virginians weigh in on it. And I think the only people who were for it at the time were the parents of our receptionists, who just got brutalized from the moment they turned on the phones to the end. And it is what launched, I think it was Obamacare and the socialization of medicine that helped launch the Tea Party in 2010. And what happened in the Senate cycle in 2010 was Senator McConnell, who rules with a pretty iron fist and is a very savvy political operator, had picked out candidates in 7 or 8 states where the Republicans had a clear shot at victory. And in every one of those states, starting with Kentucky, his candidate lost to a Tea Party candidate. So that's how we got Rand Paul. Rand Paul beat Trey Grayson in Kentucky. And in Delaware, for then Vice President Biden's seat, there was a longtime serving moderate Republican named Mike Castle, incredibly popular.
He was governor, wasn't he?
He was, I don't know. I know Carper was governor, but the bottom line was he was super popular. He was running for the Senate, but he was too moderate. And the Tea Party put up a woman who her previous job was she was a witch. Like literally. You can look it up.
Literally a witch.
And so at the end of the day, Chris Coons, who never expected, Beau Biden didn't run for that seat because he didn't want to run against Castle. Chris Coons won that seat. And in Indiana, Dick Lugar was beaten in a primary
Richard Murdoch.
Yeah, because he had taken Barack Obama to Russia to study nonproliferation issues. And so Joe Donnelly, moderate Democrat, won that seat. We won a seat in Missouri when that guy Aiken talked about there's legitimate rape and illegitimate rape. You can look it up. I'm not making this stuff up. And so the Tea Party sent a shudder through the Republican caucus.
And Mark Meadows was part of that also.
Oh, of course. Who incidentally is under investigation for trying to vote 3 different times in 3 different places, but that's not why we're here.
That he may never have been at.
Right, right. So I think the point is, someone like Senator Leahy, whose whole career was, one of his greatest achievements was in the area of nutrition.
I want to get at what these accomplishments of Leahy's were.
School breakfast and school lunch program, because as you know, malnutrition was, and to some degree still is, a huge problem in this country. The champions of nutrition programs in the Senate before Leahy got there was Bob Dole and George McGovern. Because guess what? Nutrition programs help farmers. And so again, it's a good example of government programs that both help a certain constituency, the farm community, and do enormous good for one of the biggest problems we were facing, which is child nutrition. And when I look at the Medal of Honor or Medal of Freedom and the pictures of Dole and Senator Inouye, who was also wounded and lost an arm in World War II, I think part of why things worked was because the World War II generation, if you grew up, my parents were both born, they got married late. They were both born in 1921, so they both lived through the Depression. My mother lived in a tenement house. She was Sicilian in the Lower East Side. My father's father died when he was 6, and he grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and basically his mom just rented out rooms in their house, and that's how they made it through. But if you went through World War II and the Depression, what you saw was government could play a positive role in your life. And so you may have had a parent who got a job, and part of some of the New Deal programs. But if you were Bob Dole and you were wounded, you had a veterans, you had the VA that would help you get better. My father went to college on the GI Bill, something he never would have done left to his own devices. And so government played a positive role in the lives of so many of these, and they were almost all men, who were part of the World War II generation. And I think what happened, again, you guys have so much to study, and was in the 60s and 70s, government became a euphemism for government handouts and welfare payments. And I think President Reagan kind of encapsulated and personified that message of government being the problem and not the solution.
And there's always been a lot of sarcastic remarks people have made about people who complain about government this, government does that, but don't touch my Social Security. Right?
Yeah.
But let's get back to the subject of Senator Leahy and what his accomplishments were. What do you think are the highlights of the Leahy 8 terms in office?
It's hard when you have a career that spans 50 years and, when you didn't land on the moon to have, 1 or 2 specific things. I think that his nutrition work will be, it'll both be remembered and not remembered, but it'll have one of his most lasting, it'll be one of his most lasting legacies. He was the father of the organic industry, that the organic standards were put in, and I'll get this wrong, but it'll be mostly right, in one of the farm bills, setting up an organic standard. So now, the organic industry is a multi-zillion-dollar industry. Mm-hmm. He always stood up for civil rights and individual rights in the Constitution, and Bob talks about this. After 9/11, which was a traumatic, obviously it was a national trauma, in some ways it was an international trauma, but if you were there in the Capitol, it was really scary, and all the phones were down, and Senator Leahy and I and our press guy, walked to, the press guy lived on the Hill, and there were all these rumors about other bombs that were going off and planes headed toward the Capitol. But afterwards, there were some incredible unifying moments. And I think when George Bush II, made a plea on Islam, I forget if he went to a mosque or not, but he was, I shudder to think if Trump had been president at the time, we would have had internment camps for Muslims, in my view. But what Republicans decided to do was every kind of anti-terrorism initiative that had ever been thought up anywhere, which hadn't been vetted, hadn't had hearings, everything under the sun was brought to be part of what became the Patriot Act. And Senator Leahy was one of the few people who went down and said, hold on, this is fine. This can't, this has to be vetted more. It was, and he was attacked mercilessly. I mean, a little thing that I told Bob was there were all these proposals to give medals of honor and medals of freedom. There's all these different medals to every firefighter and police officer and nurse and who came and rushed to help after 9/11. And obviously they all deserved something incredible. But there was so many different proposals that Senator Leahy says, maybe we should take a month and study what's actually the right medal that we should award these guys. And so Fox News and the Daily News, blasted his picture. This is the man standing in the way of giving our heroes their just reward. And I was in the office when a firefighter, a New York City firefighter, called our office after this Daily News headline. I think it was the Daily News. It was one of the rags. And he said, I just want you to let you know, I'm driving to Vermont to shoot and kill Senator Leahy. That was the level of vitriol that we were dealing with. And the incoming, was because we weren't tough enough. So on the international side, he really has focused more, I think, than any other elected official on helping war victims and the collateral damage of wars.
Landmines.
Landmines are the big thing, where landmines, as all of you folks know, have been spread indiscriminately, anytime there's, a battle zone. And they're in the ground long after the war stops, and the people who are victimized are farmers and women who are going out to gather firewood and children who come up on one and think it's a toy. And so he put just hundreds of hours into getting us to ban anti-personnel landmines. We first succeeded in banning the export of landmines, but he led, 58, 100 nations. America is still not where it should be. And he also started something that's now called the Leahy War Victims Fund. And that was to provide health care and prosthetics for people who have gotten, because if you have your leg blown off and you don't have an adequate prosthetic, you can't do anything if you live in Cambodia or Laos or Mozambique. And so he wanted to make sure that there was funds to help these victims of war. And he also, there's something called the Leahy Law, where he's been a fierce critic of Army and Army units that slaughter and abuse civilians in war.
Sounds kind of current, doesn't it?
And so there is a law where the Leahy Law gets kicked in if there's verifiable proof that whether it's the Turkish military or the Egyptian military or the Guatemalan military.
Or the Russian military.
Or the Russian military. So those are
okay, on the
some
subject
of
of foreign policy, but you're talking about foreign affairs here. Talk about the Cuba experience.
I'll tell you something else about the foreign policy experience is when I was a political science major, got a master's in international relations. I had no idea how the Senate worked. None. Zero. And when I got there, I actually thought that the Foreign Relations Committee was a powerful committee. And it was powerful in the sense, it's an authorizing committee. There's a difference between authorizing and appropriating. And they would have 100 staffers. And Senator Leahy was on the Appropriations Committee, and he chaired what's called the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which did the entire foreign aid budget and allocated the money. We had 3 people working there. So 100 on foreign relations, 3 for us. We did all the work. All the work. But not that we remember those things. So Senator Leahy is probably the leading guy to help in attempts to open relations with Cuba. And his view was that we tried this policy of isolation and embargo for 50 years. We at first, as you know, with Kennedy, we tried to assassinate Castro multiple times. We had a Cuban Missile Crisis that almost blew up the whole world. And he thought that we'd tried one way and we should try something else. And that is, the more exposure Cubans got to the United States, the more destabilizing it would be for Fidel. So we went, when were you born?
2000.
Okay, 1999, when you were just a glimmer in your parents' eye. We went with the Baltimore Orioles to Havana because the Orioles were playing the Cuban national team. And it was Senator Leahy, Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island. And as we were leaving the stadium, the Orioles actually won a close game. We were told that we were going to have dinner that night with Fidel. And so off we went, and we had a 4-hour dinner with Fidel Castro. And the truth is, he is a baseball savant. And lucky for me...
He wanted to be a pro. He wanted to play in the major leagues.
And lucky for me, I was the only guy in the party that knew anything about baseball. He did, I have to say, when we were going through the receiving line, he said, he looked at me, he spoke perfect English, but only spoke Spanish with Americans. He said, "You and I have met before." I said, "Well, I actually think you must mistake me for a famous Hollywood actor." He goes, "Yes, the actor Nicolas Cage." That was when Nicolas Cage was like a hunk.
Of course.
Anyway, the bottom line was, we had an incredible dinner. And every time a food course would come out, Castro would say, "This is the finest salad in the world." And then out came the lobster. He said, "This is the finest lobster in the world." And then dessert came. He said, "This is the finest ice cream in the world." And Senator Leahy said, "You know, actually, Mr. President, with all due respect, there's these two hippies in Vermont named Ben and Jerry, and they make the best ice cream in the world." And Castro says, "You must send some to me on dry ice." And and several times as we were leaving, he said, "Remember the dry ice." So being a good politician, Senator Leahy went back, called Ben, called Jerry. We were going to make like Revolution something ice cream. And he announces that we're sending ice cream to Cuba. And it's apt because we just saw the tragic news that Madeleine Albright died today.
Oh, did she?
But yeah, 84 years old. She used to work out at my gym, and like right up till her 82nd, right up till COVID. Anyway, we were in the Burlington office, and the phone rings, and it's Madeleine Albright. And she says, "Patrick, that's actually a felony." So
we had an embargo.
Right.
We couldn't send things to Cuba.
And so he just looked at me and said, "Figure it out."
Yeah, that's
so what we did
typical
was
Senate response.
The Cuban national team came to Baltimore. And so what I quietly did was arrange to have like 4 cases of Ben & Jerry's quietly put on the plane in dry ice. And about 2 months later, I got a call at my desk from the Capitol Police, and they said, "These Cubans dropped off a box." And I went down, and Castro sent back, the finest rum in the world. So that was our...
But what flavors did you send?
What's that? I'm sure, I'm sure Cherry Garcia was part of it.
I love the story. I'm glad you shared that with us. We were talking about the markers, the times big things happen where there are shifts and changes. How about the impeachments? Leahy is probably the only senator who has sat through 3 presidential impeachments. There have been 4 in the history of the country. 3, Leahy's been
Well, the thing about the first impeachment, which was
Bill Clinton's.
We thought it was a once in a lifetime, not a once in a generation thing, because it was a once in a generation thing. And it may have been, ironically, one of the last gasps of the bipartisan Senate, because the House impeached Clinton on a party line vote. Basically, maybe I don't have somebody, don't look at your phones, please, but maybe there were a couple Republicans who voted, but it was Republicans were for impeaching him, Democrats were not. And the White House very much wanted, it was no secret, they wanted it just to be a partisan exercise. They knew there weren't going to be 67 votes to actually remove him from office. And the more partisan it was, the better it was for the White House and actually for Democrats. But what happened was that Senator Kennedy, and this was Senator Leahy, had an idea that they should all go in to the old Senate chamber, which if you ever visit Washington is on the tour. It's an incredible place. And figure out how to proceed, and this time it was on how many witnesses were going to be interviewed. And Senator Kennedy, and I'm 95% sure it was Senator Phil Graham, conservative Republican from Texas, came up with an agreement that they were going to do Monica Lewinsky, Vernon Jordan, maybe Blumenthal, and then if there were going to be any other interviews, they had to be agreed on a bipartisan way. So there was a bipartisan agreement on how to proceed with the impeachment trial. And the White House was livid. So it was a situation where I have my TV on and I see, Major Garrett on the White House lawn saying, "The White House is delighted with these turn of events." And I have on the phone a very senior White House person screaming at me about what a disaster this is. But that was a time where like when Goldwater went to talk to Nixon, that's when the Senate decided they were actually going to do this straight and do their constitutional duty. And so Rehnquist would preside every day. There would be an hour for lunch where everybody, Lindsey Graham was on the other side, lawyers, senators would all rush into the senator's dining room together, eat their food, and then go back out. Obviously, a very different circumstance, with the Trump impeachment.
In thinking about the differences, I talk a lot, obviously, about Birch Bayh, and I wrote the book, but there have been 11,000 attempts in our history to amend the Constitution. And since the Bill of Rights, only 17 have been successful. And Birch Bayh had 2 of them. And I always say, well, then he deserves a place in the Hall of Fame of legislators.
No question.
But I would ask you, what constitutional amendment could pass today?
Oh, none.
None.
I mean, we can't.
Nothing.
We couldn't pass a bill that says the sun rises in the east and sets in the west.
And we like Mom.
Yeah. Yeah. No, impossible. Impossible. I mean, I think you can see, another thing that happened, and I know Senator Leahy was so appalled by it, when Senator Lott had to give up the majority leadership because he made comments about Strom Thurmond and in his 1948 presidential race, Senator Frist from Tennessee, who had only been in the body a few years, was a famous surgeon. The White House they kind of airdropped him in to be Senate Majority Leader. And he went, and the Democratic leader was Tom Daschle from South Dakota, who was kind of a prairie populist, but literally the nicest person on the face of the earth. And Frist actually went to South Dakota and campaigned against Daschle, which was something so unheard of, where one leader, because if you're a leader, there's a Democratic leader, Republican leader, you have to interact with each other 10 times a day, agreeing on what bill's going to come up, what days are you going to take off, how many amendments are going to be allowed. So the idea that Senator Dole would have gone to either West Virginia for Robert Byrd or Maine for George Mitchell, it just never would have happened in a million years. But it was part of the great sorting. Daschle ultimately lost a very close race to John Thune, where everything was political and kind of nothing was sacrosanct.
We are going to have to turn ourselves to audience questions, but I have one remaining question I want to ask you, actually two-part question. One is in talking about personalities. You have a major personality from Vermont who the audience is well aware of, and Bernie Sanders, the colleague of Senator Leahy. But also, I would ask, in terms of personalities, what person would you have if we could just snap and have somebody in charge?
Well, this is we talked about this, and this is actually, I would love some audience participation here, because this is a question. My wife, who's much more professionally accomplished than I am, works for National Public Radio. And we actually kind of accidentally got invited to an A-list dinner party a couple weeks ago. We're usually C-listers. But the guy who I won't name, who's a very prominent person, very thoughtful, very smart, said, to get the conversation going at dinner, said, if you could appoint one person president, no elections, no primaries, you can't change their age, and the goal is to unify as many of the American people as you can, who would that person be?
And it's a great question.
Think about it. And this is where we see if anyone is, brave enough to, do you want to give it a go?
Mitt Romney.
I thought about Mitt Romney. Who else? Come on, you guys, you're from Kansas. You're plain-speaking Kansans. Well, no, I mean, the point, I think that's part of the point of the question.
That's not an answer, though.
If you asked this question 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would have said the pre-Iraq War, Colin Powell would have been an obvious answer. Warren Buffett, he's now 92, maybe when he was 75. Oprah. Those kind, if you go way back in the day, Walter Cronkite, who was a very respected newscaster. But when I thought about
Leahy
this...
Coca at the time, somebody like that.
But when I thought about this, I'm like, it's impossible to come up with someone who would get 60% of the American people behind them. So I was looking for 53%. The host who raised the question said Mitch Daniels, who's now the president of Purdue, former governor of Indiana. Someone else said Michelle Obama. I think she's too polarizing.
Yeah.
My pick? All right, someone else go first, and then I'll tell you my pick. Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is a kind of Oprah-like choice. Who else? Okay, don't throw stuff at me. My pick was Sonia Sotomayor. That she has a plain spokenness. She's super smart. She's tough enough on crime and criminal justice stuff. She's of Puerto Rican descent, and I kind of feel like her kind of straight talking approach might get us to 53 or 54%.
Well, let me go to the questions and say, if those people online, if you have a question, you can ask your question at Dole Questions at ku.edu, and I would ask the audience here to both try to answer Luke's question as well as ask us your own. What kind of questions might we have here? Michael, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I was wondering, you mentioned you got a master's degree in international relations. I was wondering, like, I guess how that, like, did you feel like that was useful in like your political career? And I was also just generally wondering like what you did as the chief of staff and like how you assisted Senator Leahy.
You know, the truth about my academic stuff was I was so, I don't know.
No one would ever accuse me of that.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so I kind of stumbled into my professional life. But, you know, what I think it helped in having a tutor who paid attention to me and told me when I was an idiot, you know, it made me a better writer. It made me a better thinker. You know, one of the reasons, you know, I got a job, I had a master's degree, I got a job answering mail, but I actually did a really good job answering mail. And this is something that is sweeping now the hill about young staffers, and here I'm going to go, and my kids, they'll never watch it this long, but about we only want to work, you know, we only want to work our 7.5 hours every day. It was, I would come in on a Saturday and spend, like when the phones aren't ringing, I would spend 12 hours answering mail so that on Monday I could go to a hearing, I could write a memo, I could help draft a speech. What I worry a little bit, and I have no doubt young people are exploited, they're underpaid, they're unappreciated. I get all, particularly on Capitol Hill, but it's an office by office thing. I was lucky I had mentors who really helped me grow. And the thing about a chief of staff, every chief of staff's job is unique. Part of the biggest job, I think, of being a chief of staff is being the guy that'll take the arrow through the head, to be the first guy through the door, where you're willing to go in and tell the senator, I understand you want to do this, but this really isn't a good idea, and explain why. Part of it is, with Senator Warner, Senator Leahy ended up really trusting me and trusting his staff. And that gave you the huge ability to go out and explore deals and explore other initiatives. We haven't talked about the Innocence Protection Act, which, after DNA testing provided testing for perhaps wrongly accused convicts and people on death row. Senator Warner is definitely a genius and was an incredibly successful governor of Virginia and founded Nextel and made $1 zillion. It wasn't enough. I mean, we're very close. But what I did as a chief of staff when I had to try to get him up on issues was I would bring in experts constantly. So I wanted to make sure I had enough time so that I could get him the information he needed so he could make decisions. There are some chiefs, I'd say, who are inward-facing, who some pick the boss up in the morning. They're always with the boss. I feel like that's a disservice to the senator. It's about being more outward-facing and knowing that because you have your name attached to a senator, you can talk to anyone in the world. You can tap incredible, experts. And there's also a political side that, at some point we can talk about.
I used to say I was spoiled that I never had any experience of my calls not being returned.
I'll tell you how when I first left Senator Leahy, I saw another colleague who had been Senator Fritz Holling's chief of staff, and he looked at me and said, let me guess, your phone stops ringing. And, it's a real lesson, and it's a lesson for all of us in how sorting out who your real friends are and who your transactional friends. I don't know in Lawrence, Kansas, what the equivalent is, but if you work in government, you instantly, that's the instant sorting. When you leave, you very quickly find out who are real friends and who are just interested in you because you're affiliated with a power center.
And that's even truer if you end that career by an election defeat. And I remember very vividly people I did hear from and people I didn't hear from after that.
No, that I would get calls. I was out for 4.5 years. I went back to Senator Warner's office, and I would hear all of a sudden my transactional friends were calling me, hey, how are you doing? Haven't talked to you in a while. And I'm like, well, that's actually because you haven't returned my phone calls in the last 4.5 years.
Yeah. It's a unique experience. And when you're talking about how hard you would work and being there all day on Saturday, I was single the entire time I worked in the Senate for 13 years. And yeah, it was a 7-day job. And I loved it that it was a 7-day week job.
Yeah, but the other thing about Senator Leahy that's true is, as I said, and it's not a joke, my wife, she ran the Washington desk at NPR for 10 years. She ran election coverage, every presidential election for many cycles. And so we had and we had 4 kids. At one point we had 6-year-old twins that were almost 2 and a baby. So those were the dark years. So we had to figure this out together. And to Senator Leahy's eternal credit, he is a computer whiz. He's like the first senator who was emailing. He and Ted Kennedy had the first web page. So I would go online with him at 6 in the morning, and I would leave. Generally, I think I had the mornings with the kids, and my wife would generally pick kids up. But we would do so much work just over the computer, and he really respected, I think he learned, and he had people who've stayed with him forever, that if you treat your workers like real human beings with real lives, they'll stay with you more. Yeah.
So we've had a lot of people on here who have worked for like one senator or maybe not worked for any. So what was it like working for a senator in Vermont and then transferring your skills into working for another senator in a different state?
It's a very good question. And you know, my kids, I had great uncles who fought in the Pennsylvania Cavalry, and I'm a Civil War buff, and I used to.
7th by chance?
I think it was the 9th.
Great uncle that fought.
Simeon Albee. Look up Simeon and see. They might have been bunkmates. But I was always lecturing my kids that they couldn't go to college south of the Mason-Dixon line. And one of my sons is named Grant, and I had a dog named Sherman. Anyway, when I came home and told them I was going to work for Senator Warner, they're like, Dad, the heart of the Confederacy?
It's from
Now,
Virginia.
the truth is, Virginia was turning purple, if not bluish, despite the last gubernatorial election. But what was really interesting is, with Senator Leahy, he's chairman of a committee. We have 120 people working for us. We have Supreme Court clerks. I could muse out loud about something, and I'd have a Supreme Court clerk write a memo for the senator, you know, within 2 hours. With Senator Warner, he had been a governor who had like 135,000 people working for him in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's a freshman senator who's used to getting stuff done. And, you know, I remember early on when we were doing the first, it was a stimulus bill that was less than $1 trillion, the 800. And he was like the only guy who understood what multimodal funding was, and he had this idea for multimodal funding. In the morning, he's like, okay, we got to do this. Let's, you know, multimodal. And like at 4 o'clock, he comes back and says, is that done? I said, Senator, we got 3 people working for you. One of them's me. One of them's answering the phones. We actually don't have that done. We're not close to having it done. And so what I did was I did what I said in an earlier, like during the Dodd-Frank, the banking bill, he worked very closely with Senator Corker, who's a Republican from Tennessee, and we just leveraged his brains and role and brought in every expert under the sun and did a huge. Senator Dodd, who was chairman of banking, gave him the opportunity to do a bill. So it was really interesting. I knew, you know, Virginia is basically 5 different states all wrapped, you know, inside its borders. But it was a very, very different experience. And every
plus the
time,
personalities are very different
very,
also.
very, very different. Yeah,
That's huge.
Yeah. Now, one thing I noticed, can I just say that I spent a lot of time helping first-time women candidates run for office, first with Emily's List, and how to do debates, how to do everything. But when you study the difference in men and women and how and one of the things is, it's how men raise their hands different than women. And I just noticed that. You gave it one of these, he gave it one of these, you deferred to him. It was a very good question. But it just reminded me, women, when you raise your hand, raise your hand.
Well, she deferred to him because Will went to him with the
Yeah,
microphone.
well, that's,
so there you go.
Will is conditioned to see the hand.
Yeah, look at you being complicit over there.
Yeah, make sure he remembers this.
Hi. You served for, or you worked for Senator Leahy, who's been in the Senate for 48 years now, I want to say.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's influenced or shaped your opinion on, I don't know, the common complaint that the Senate is too old, that people serve too long at all?
You know,
term limits.
Yeah.
Should there be?
Yeah, you know, I have to say that as we age, you know, part of it is, it's like a car. How many miles are on your odometer, right? That you can have a 20-year-old car that only has 60,000 miles and it still runs pretty well. You can have an 8-year-old car that's got 200,000 miles. Basically, I think it is a problem. It is a problem. I love Senator Leahy and have and will and would crawl over broken glass for him. He also still is a very serious functioning member of the body. But there are a lot of senators, and we saw them all, who basically, you know, couldn't function as even average senators with either physical limitations or a lot of times it was mental limitations. And, you know, it's like old people in driving. Like, I happen to think that once you turn 75 or 80, not 75, Bob, you should have to take a driving, you should have to take a driver's test every 18 months. And we just had in Washington, D.C., right near my house.
That's right.
The senior citizen guy came out of a gas station, hit the gas, lost control, went right into a lunch crowd, killed several people,
2 women,
injured 10. So, but the other thing that's true about the Senate is, if you're there and you have 100 people working for you, and, you know, whenever you go home, there's someone who meets you and makes sure the milk isn't spoiled in your fridge. And if you've got your gout acts up, you can go to the Capitol physician. It's a hard thing to leave. So I've always been against term limits. And, you know, I've always said that we have term limits and they're called elections. But it's something that I'm open to.
You know, I share your concern, because I felt if we believe in democracy and elected government, we should say the people have the right to decide whether someone stays or goes. But at the same time, we know as a practical matter, there are many people that are in given offices too long.
Yeah.
Do we have any others here? You know, I do want to turn the attention to Bernie Sanders for a second, because
Sure.
we talk about a personality that everyone now is aware of, and what was it like being his? Called his colleague in the state.
You know, as I told Bob, Bernie was a perennial third-party candidate in Vermont, and actually ran against Senator Leahy in 1974 on the Liberty Union ticket. He was a film strip maker. He ended up getting 3 or 4% of the vote, and almost cost Senator Leahy the seat. And there was a funny, when Bernie was then, he ultimately was elected mayor of Burlington. He won by 6 votes. He was an incredibly good mayor. He had replaced an old sleepy guy, and he plowed the streets, and he set up daycare, and he invested the city's money. Bernie got elected to the House, and he and Senator Leahy have always had a good relationship. But he is an avowed socialist, but he has an appeal that crosses party lines. And he's made the same speech all his life about the millionaires and billionaires. But raging against Wall Street, raging against the disparities in wealth, you know, he's a guy that kind of the times caught up with him. And so he has moved the dialogue in this country. And he and Senator Leahy, you know, have always got along.
There's no question he's moved the dialogue. And for those who are not aware, I want to point out an interesting part of the Leahy personality and his history is his role in the Batman movies.
Now, that's true. I mean, he was born basically blind in one eye. And so that meant sports, with the exception of shooting, and he's a champion marksman, and I'm not a shooter, but I seem to remember you close one eye when you shoot. Maybe that was the Olden Day guns. But he was always, as a kid, fascinated by comic books and The Dark Knight and Batman. We grew up watching, you know, Bruce Wayne and the TV show. He's a comic book, you know, idiot savant. And the Batman people kind of learned about that. And when they were reissuing comics, he'd write the introductions. So it's kind of a natural thing for him, but it's something that it's something that has helped bond him, that and his Grateful Dead obsession, you know, to another generation of Vermonters.
Well, he voiced the territorial governor in the Batman the Animated Series. He appeared as himself in Batman and Robin, and appeared twice in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy as Wayne Enterprises board member, and he had actually lines with the Joker.
Yeah, and the nice thing, I mean, there are many nice things about him, but any residual money that he gets from these appearances, he gives to the Kellogg Hubbard Library in Montpelier, which is the library that he, as a boy, used to go to read Batman and other things. So, you know, the Kellogg Hubbard is one of the best funded little libraries in Vermont, thanks to Batman.
You know, there's another story that, which was, a lot of us were aware of at the time, that he had a confrontation with Vice President Cheney at the time. He had made some remarks about the Halliburton people.
How many of you guys know this story? Okay. All right, I'm going to try to tell it in a way that
tell it in an acceptable manner. This
that
is
C-SPAN doesn't
for young
black
people in
us
the
out.
audience.
So Vice President Cheney was the vice president. And, you know, he really, you know, 9/11 really, you know, he kind of, it had a profound effect on him. And, you know, he really became darker and darker. Anyway, Senator Leahy, kind of in the matter of political, the DNC said, you know, can a few of you criticize Dick Cheney for his role as the Halliburton CEO who didn't pay any taxes? And they went down, and that happened, and Leahy was quoted. So they went down to the Senate floor, and there was some interaction. And a couple days later, Jackie Calmes, who was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, called me and said, sounds like Senator Leahy and the vice president really went at it on the Senate floor. And I said, yeah, I can. And she goes, I'm supposed to write something about it. Can you? And she's a very good friend of mine. Can you find out and call me back? So I walked into Senator Leahy's office, and he was on his computer sorting photographs because he's a professional photographer. And I said, you know, Jackie Calmes from the Journal just called me and said that the vice president told you to go to hell. And he goes, that's absolutely 100% false. He told me to go perform an anatomical exercise that would have been impossible for him to perform. Did I do that all right?
Yes, that's right.
So anyways, that then became a pretty big story.
Particularly in Washington.
And, yeah, and then when he brought Bernie down to be sworn in, and Cheney sworn in, and it was the first time he'd seen Cheney, you know, his line was, better to be sworn in than sworn at. So.
Well, look, I appreciate everybody showing up today. I'm delighted to have Luke with us. Let's give him a round of applause here. And I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks when we reconvene here again at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, April 6th. We'll have with me John Shea, who is at the Paul Simon Institute, has written books on Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and former Senator Richard Lugar as well. So I look forward to having you with us at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for everything.